Michele Perchonok, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, we are delighted to have you here. Let's toast on that.
And I'm delighted to be here.
So now I thought it would really be great that we just start right in to talk about what it's like to be a food scientist, because I think that's where it all starts, you know, and your desire to do that, because that's really what you are, amongst all the other things, but that's really where we got to start.
So food science is a multidisciplinary field. It's, of course, anchored with science. And I was a chemistry undergraduate major, but realized I wanted the applied field. I wanted to see what I was working on and how it was going to come to be used by other people and other consumers. So when I discovered food science, it's like, this is perfect for me. And some of my products were in the grocery store within months of starting to work in the industry, which was exciting.
But that's kind of interesting because there's so many other things you could have done. And I'm telling you, I would bet most women, men come up to you and say, you had the dream job working at NASA.
Mm-hmm.
You know, everybody says they want to work at NASA. So I have to ask, how many times did you hear that?
Oh, too many to count.
So now you're retired, but you know, you had just years at NASA. I mean, that job and being a food scientist, because I know we had this conversation and people wanted to say, well, we would have to talk to the chefs at NASA. I mean, you're not a chef at NASA.
No, and it took us a long time to, I'll call it, training our public affairs and outreach rep when he would get a phone call from anywhere from, you know, whether it was a TV show with chefs or someone else, and they'd say, we want to talk to the NASA chefs. He would finally got through and said, no, these are food scientists. They are not chefs. If you would like to talk to the food scientists, I can arrange that.
I would bet all the astronauts who spent time in space would say, no, these are not chefs. These are scientists
Yes.
who are making sure our food tastes well going up there.
Yes, we were always well appreciated by the astronauts. In fact, everyone. So the astronauts are the first ones to admit that they cannot be going up in space without the help of everyone at NASA, whether it's the food scientists or the engineers or anyone else. They need our support.
And Mike, I don't think we have anything else for you guys. You can swap out the cards in the KFX machine and we'll get those down overnight. Other than that, you guys have a great night. Great working with you today.
Good work. Well, thanks, Megan. Great work with the team. And, you know, I think we got to make a little shout-out to our food group. We're just enjoying our second Big Joy meal with the crew, and a lot of that stuff was specially packed by our specialists. So I guess special thanks to Vicki Claris and our Michele Perchonok and Michelle Pittman for just really outfitting us up here. It's really nice to have a big, hearty meal together with everybody after a long days of work like that. So thanks to those guys, and thanks to everybody who took care of us today.
We'll pass along those kind words, and you guys sure earned a good meal tonight. Good night.
Good night.
So how do you end up telling someone, explain NASA's food science program? Because this isn't something that's a small investment. I mean, this is something that takes a lot of work to really look at what you want to do to come up with the right foods that astronauts are going to eat and that they're going to like, and that it's not any small investment to really look at and find the right combinations, because you talked about, remember when we were talking earlier, some trips are camping trips and some are really long trips into space.
Right. So we have sort of two pieces of what we'll call the food lab, or the Space Food Systems Laboratory. One is what we call flight food. So this is the actual food going up, whether it was for shuttle until it retired or currently for International Space Station. And that becomes a distribution system. You know, what do we need to do to get that food in space for our astronauts so that they can eat? Then we had the research piece of it, which is what I managed a lot of, and I did the shuttle food system for the last few years. But the research piece is, okay, we're not only going to the International Space Station, we're going to go to Mars or to the moon first or somewhere. How do we enable our astronauts to be able to go into space for a longer period of time where they have a safe, nutritious, and acceptable food system? And that's what we were looking at. And it's a juggling act. It's really, but if you do this, what happens here? Oh yeah, well, that's not going to work. And so we had a lot of brainstorming sessions, which was fun.
So looking at this, now I understand you worked at the Johnson Space Center for a while, then it was the Kennedy Space Center, and the food products.
I never worked at Kennedy.
Okay, so you were a part of then the different types of things that you did. So what were the types of projects you did, were they different in the types of food then? Did it make a difference?
It
like
did
that?
make a difference. So we had two pieces of what we'll call the exploration food system. One is the packaged food system, which could look like the current food system for International Space Station or the former food system for the shuttle. But it may be, it would have to, for a Mars mission, it would have to have a shelf life of 5 to 7 years instead of the 18 months on International Space Station. So it may have a different set of foods, a different way we process the foods, a different way we're packaging the foods. And then we had another whole other piece of a food system, which what we called our bioregenerative food system, which is how do we grow crops on the Mars surface in greenhouses or plant chambers.
So we're talking about growing things
Growing.
up there.
So we have fresh food. Maybe we bring up in bulk other food like soybeans or wheat berries. And now we can provide that variety, because if they're up there for 2.5 years, they want variety. They want even variety on a 6-month mission on the International Space Station. But certainly for a 2.5-year mission, they're going to need that variety. So how do we provide that, and how do we mix and match?
So how long have you been studying specific types of flavors and foods? I mean, this is something you had to be studying for a long time to say, we want to give them the variety. If they're going to be up there a couple of years, this isn't something you say, well, we've been studying for a little while. I mean, it had to take you a long time to be studying. So is there certain types of flavors you'd been studying for a long period of time? I mean, trying to understand, someone's up there and says, I'm not going to eat that. That tastes like cardboard.
Right. So a couple of things. One is we have a history. So we know, even from Apollo days, what they liked and didn't like and what things taste like. And now, of course, International Space Station, we have astronauts who are up there for 6 months. So we get, and we debrief them when they come home. And they may make comments like, I got really tired of this flavor, or I really love the shrimp cocktail because it's spicy. It's got horseradish flavor. So anecdotally, we've never done any real scientific controlled experiments. We hear that more spice is important because they almost act as if they have a cold up in space, because a lot of their fluid has shifted from their lower extremities to their head. So they feel like they have a cold, they're congested. The other problem is, is a lot of what you taste is what you smell. Well, in gravity, those aromas are warmer and lighter, so they will waft up to your face, to your nose. In microgravity, where there is no gravity, those aromas could go to your feet. Well, that doesn't do you any good. So we have to, so we know they've lost a lot of that sensory piece. And so we learned to work with that. And on International Space Station and Shuttle, the answer was, we're just going to send up hot sauces or other flavors. So you can add if you want. Now on a Mars mission, if we go, when we go there, there's gravity on Mars. It's 3/8 gravity. So we expect they'll be able to taste a little bit better, but we won't know until we get there.
Until they get there. So you have a team that's you worked with a team that tried to put all these puzzle pieces together to figure all this out. And so it had to be important for all of you to work together. So I guess I'm curious, was there a favorite astronaut that you liked, that you worked with, that he said, you know what, I really like this? Because I got to imagine there had to be some finicky astronauts. So who'd you like the best?
Oh, now you're going to ask me to take
now
favorites.
I got it. There might have been somebody you liked more than others.
Oh, so the one who considered himself the food guru was Michael Barrett, Dr. Michael Barrett. He was a physician. And he flew on both International Space Station and Shuttle. And he basically adopted himself on the shuttle mission that I managed, and said, or for the food system, and said, I'm the food guru. I'm going to help plan this and make sure everyone understands what's going on. So Michael is certainly I would call him an expert. A lot of them consider themselves experts. Some that the ones who were from the military may not care as much about the food. They're there to complete the mission. And so those are, so we just give them sort of a basic menu and say, fine. On the shuttle, they do have their personal preference menu, so we can sort of mix and match. So for the astronauts who want it to be more specific, we could give them more of, maybe the meatloaf, or more shrimp cocktail, or more of the chocolate pudding cake. So we could give them a variety.
So you had some who are more the hearty meat eaters or the fish eaters, or those who said, I want certain ways, So did you have some finicky astronauts you had to deal with?
I won't call them well, a couple were finicky where they would say, I have to have my omega-3s. And it's like, okay.
They're going to space, but got to have their omega-3s.
For 2 weeks, you're going to space, but you got to have your omega-3s. So we gave them the salmon and the tuna and other items. Others would say, I'm lactose intolerant. So we would have to stay away from the macaroni and cheese or other cheese or yogurt items. Most of them were really reasonable, and sometimes we would just have to say, you need to have a little bit more variety. You can't just have only these 3 items for your meals all the time. You need to do a little bit more variety. And we had a dietitian who would work with them on that. But they knew which items they preferred on the shuttle menu. They tasted them before the mission, and not all of them, but enough of them that they would realize what they wanted.
How important was coffee to an astronaut going up to space? I assume, they're concerned about the mission, but I got to think coffee still reigns supreme going up to, space.
Coffee is a huge need. I even heard from the Apollo astronauts when we went back and debriefed them 30 years after the fact, and said, how important was your hot coffee in the, during the day or in the morning? Oh, really important, because there was a study that the engineer said, hot water takes power, takes volume, takes, all sorts of resources. We're not going to provide hot water. And by asking the Apollo astronauts, they said, nope, don't take away our coffee. Just recently, one of our International Space Station astronauts got a special pack of super duper coffee. I don't remember what they called it, but it was extra, extra strong coffee. Coffee is very important to them, and the coffee has to be packaged the way they drink it. So if you drink it with cream and sugar, then we have to package it with the coffee granules and the cream, dry cream and sugar all together, so when they hydrate, they have their coffee as they like it.
So how does it work for those who might be watching this? You are ergonomists, if I say that right, and a food scientist, and you guys are working, and what's the different roles that happen so that you guys have that now? There's different roles that you guys all play, because you're saying growing and things, and what you guys do. What's the different role that you have there?
So the agronomists are gonna grow the plants, and they're worried about how much light and how much water and what fertilizer and how long does it take to grow a harvested fruit of whatever they're looking for. We're looking at, does it taste good? Does it look and feel like a cherry tomato? Some of the cherry tomatoes that they were growing at one point were extremely efficient to grow, but when you bit into it, all you tasted was water. There was no tomato flavor. It was extremely, tomatoes are full of water, but this was even more full of water. So we consider all of it, and then at some point we have to figure out how much nutrition is in that fruit, that tomato, that pepper, whatever.
So how does that come to play from a mindset of an astronaut who's going to eat something, and his perception is, I think it's going to taste like steak and eggs, and if it doesn't, that's going to play a real role. I think I'm eating that, and they don't even, it doesn't even come close.
There is a very large psychological piece to food acceptability, especially when you are far away from home. You imagine you're away from, especially the International Space Station missions, or even Mars for 2.5 years, you're away from friends and family, and you can't just go to the local restaurant you like to go to when you're tired of whatever's in the galley to eat. So food is extremely important, how it tastes, what it looks like, what the expectation is. Now, having said that, at some point, if you're hungry enough, you're going to eat. But you probably will not eat enough. You'll probably only eat, throw a number out, 70 to 80% of what you should be eating. Well, that's 70 to 80% of your nutrition that you need. of your calories that you need. And in microgravity, it's very important to eat enough, or you start losing more bone mass, muscle mass, and all sorts of other things.
So when you look at this right now, and I think sometimes we take for granted of really the power of what you've had to learn through the years, and being a food scientist and talking about that, that's not typical of someone who, certainly a woman now of your age, to actually be a food scientist. Talk a little bit about who's inspired you, because coming up, not only to be where you are, now you're retired, but you talk about your father, and you actually come from like a family of foodies, I guess, you know, that food family.
Right.
And that's kind of inspiring, because looking at that, it's not only that you say, okay, you wanted to be a food scientist or you did this, but that your father was instrumental in that, and you have a grandfather that, talk a little bit about that, because I think it really says like a whole history of a generational kind of flow to this.
There's in my father's side of the family, there were 3 generations of foodies. So my father's father and mother owned a grocery store in Worcester, Massachusetts. My mother's father and mother owned a kosher delicatessen in the Catskills in Monticello, and provided the hot dogs and the pickles to all the kosher camps and hotels in the Catskills. So they were sort of the basic grocery. And then my father was a vice president of new product marketing at Dunkin' Donuts, so a food service company. Learned how to market restaurant items. In fact, wrote a book on strategic marketing and food service. And so he was part of that piece of it, so the business side, and then I became the scientist.
So looking at that, you would say your father, though, has been very
Yes.
instrumental in as being a mentor and encouraged you to get where you are today.
Yes. So my father would always say a few things. One is, first of all, if you're going to do a job, do it once in the right way. You know, you don't want to do it again. He was also, because he was sort of in that line of business and sort of understood, though he wasn't a scientist, managed the R&D lab, the research and development lab at Dunkin' in his last part of his career. He at least understood how marketing and food would interplay, and how do you present yourself in business, and especially a woman in business. You know, I talked to him a lot. I asked a lot of questions. I really wanted his advice on how to handle myself in that kind of environment. And he was extremely respected in his field, and so I learned a lot. And you know, he was probably my biggest mentor.
Would you say there were a lot of food scientists in NASA during the time you had been at NASA as well? Did you see a lot?
There weren't a lot. So there, in the food lab at any time, there might have been 5 or 6 of us. You know, we learned a lot from each other, and we learned a lot from history. So one of the food scientists who retired about the time I got there in 2000, Dr. Charles Borland, had been there all the way from the beginning, from Gemini. And so he would certainly, and wrote papers, but he was there for many years to advise us on what he had observed and how to work through this whole thing. And then other people had been in the field there for 25 years, so they would teach us. But it was always good to get the new point of view, the new outlook. Coming from the food industry, I was able to understand a little bit better what distribution might mean and things like that, shelf life. So brought some changes along.
So you had your father in mentor you.
Mm-hmm.
You had a great food scientist at NASA that was there. Were there other women that you were able to see with you at NASA that were women who were food scientists as well?
There were. So the food lab, typically there might be, it went back and forth, but it was at least half and half women and men who are food scientists.
So looking at that now, this is an industry when we look at STEM programs and we try to encourage this next generation to continue to stay in math and science and things like this. How do we get other women to see what you have seen right now, to say that this is exciting times, innovation, food and the sciences, being in, because as you said, so many women say they want to be, or men want to be where you are, to be, they'd love to be at NASA. How do we get them to see this is an amazing time to be in technology?
Getting out there and talking to people, going to the schools, the Institute of Food Technologists put out many years ago, A Day in the Life of a NASA Food Scientist. I had, in fact, just last month, someone came up to me at our annual meeting and said, I want you to know, I saw a video of you when I was, I don't know, middle school or high school, and I now have my master's in food science. That video inspired her to go into food science. So but you can't until, especially food science, so many people don't know it even exists. It's not a science topic that you learn in high school. It's not something you even would normally go to in college. In fact, if you look at what are the high schools that call them, they have food science classes, what are they? They're typically, how do you work in a restaurant and keep food safe, all of the sanitation practices, which is such a small piece of food science and really isn't the science piece of it. So it's a matter of trying to say, hey, you love chemistry or you love biology, but have you thought about applying that to the food area?
But think about you. You didn't even think you
No.
had the confidence to do this yourself. I
No.
mean, look at your career going to Brown and things like that. Talk about that, because you had to be nudged to continue to go on.
Well, I even had to be nudged to go to Brown. So, I got in. I have no idea to this day why I got in. And they had a very difficult program to get a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry. Very aggressive, and I'm saying, I can't do that. So I went and talked to the chair of the department, nice man, Dr. Clapp, and he turned to me and said, of course you can do it. We wouldn't have accepted you if you couldn't do it. So you try. Do it. If you have to drop down to the Bachelor of Arts, okay, but we know you can do it. You just have to know you can do it. And so that was the beginning, so yes, I didn't have the confidence to even go to an Ivy League school in chemistry. And then food science, I had to get pushed because, again, I didn't know what food science was. So I happened to spend the summer in the R&D lab at Dunkin' Donuts. Of course, my father was instrumental in finding that job for me. And the entire summer, the R&D director spent the summer saying, we need good chemists to be going into food science. Taught me handed me the food science, Intro to Food Science book and said, read it. I want you to understand what it is. Gave chemistry a try the next summer and immediately called up Andre and said, okay, I want food science for graduate school. It's applied. I get what you're saying. And, what schools do I apply to? Got into Cornell, decided to go there. Cornell was trying things out because all of a sudden my class had a biology major, a chemistry major. There were a bunch of us going into the graduate program with no food science background. How do you teach food science to a good scientist? And they figured we all took the Intro to Food Science class with the freshmen. But what I realized at least is food science was easy to learn compared to chemistry. There's still a lot to learn, but it's not as complicated. If you understand the science, the basic chemistry, the food science comes out easy.
But now you have this PhD, but now you're encouraging others to say, because now you're going to take on, you've retired, you've moved on from NASA, but now you said, I'm not just going to sit back, read books, I'm going to enjoy my garden. I'm going to take on and being the new president of IFT, the Institute of Food Technologists. Why are you going to do that?
I want to give back, for one thing. Plus, the Institute of Food Technologists, IFT, has been my second family for 30 plus years. I've been a member for over 40, but active in the association for 30. It is a wonderful way to get to know people, to meet some really high-powered food scientists and to have them become your friends, to network. But what's more important is IFT, not only did I learn the science by attending some of their courses and their annual meeting, but I learned leadership. How do you become a really good leader and communicator? And that was so important because, to me at least, being a scientist in the lab wasn't enough. I wanted to be able to prove my case. Why do you need shelf life? Why is that important in a rice mix? Why is that important for a NASA mission? So not only do you have to develop how are you going to measure that? But you also have to convince people that it makes sense to do that. Well, to do that, you have to understand the communication skills and how do you take leadership roles? How do you manage a team of food scientists to motivate them, to make them passionate about figuring out how do you get a food system to Mars?
Talk about that, because you've had to have failure along the way. How do you explain to this younger generation they're going to fail, but failure is good? And what do you learn from failure? If you really want something and you failed, how do you show them what they should do with that failure? Or if they want something, how do they explain something with what they're going to try to educate or they want?
Failure is part of living. I remember, again, my father, my mentor, I remember when I was in probably high school or something, and I came home and said, I got a 95 on my test. And his question was, what did you get wrong? And
Thanks,
did
Dad.
you learn from that? Well, yeah, that's what I was saying. But, that's part of what is learning. So when something fails, why did it fail? What are you going to do differently so that it doesn't fail again? So, part of science is I have a hypothesis, and then you want to prove your hypothesis. I think that this food is going to be acceptable. Okay. Well, what happens if it ends up the food is not acceptable? All right, now you have a new research problem. How are you going to figure that one out? So it's a learning experience, and that's what science is all about. If science were that cut and dry, that you were always right, it'd be boring. So by making mistakes, by trying new things, you learn. And my first job, I was in the pet food division at Quaker Oats, and my boss said, I want you to try this formulation for the cats. And I said, but I really think this poultry byproduct might give us some better flavor. He didn't want me to do it. Well, I tried it. Didn't work, but at least I had tried what I wanted to try to see, and okay, it didn't work, so that's okay. I've learned my lesson there.
So in looking at this, is a lot of lessons to have people go off and try on their own, or to actually make a point of why they're trying? Is it twofold? I mean, because a lot of times I think, people are determined to do it their way without trying to make the case of why, or to communicate what their mission or what their objective is.
Right. So this is where learning how to communicate and even learning some leadership roles is very helpful. So no one, unless you're in your own business, should be going off in your own little, avenue without consulting with other people.
NASA wouldn't have had that, right?
No, none of us. No one should. And so part of it is to say, I think this is a really good idea. And then the question is, okay, tell us why you think it's a good idea. And what are you going to do about it? And how are you going to go about it? And to have a discussion, whether it's one-on-one or team to team, to say, explain to me why you think this is a good idea. And then write up the proposal. And let's look at it again and see, so that because all of that is a learning experience. So I will say that unless you're in academia, 90% of us who have a PhD in food science have never done work in our PhD area after we graduate. But what you've learned is how to attack a problem. You find the problem, you figure out how you want to solve the problem, you do the science, you analyze the data, and you come up with the results and conclusion. And then you go back and say, did I solve my problem? Or did I start 5 new problems, which is okay. At NASA, people would say, well, you'll do this, this, and this. I said, no, we're going to do this, and then we're going to decide, do we go in this direction or that direction or both? Because we're going to learn more stuff, and we're going to have more questions that need to be answered. And so that's what research is all about.
When we look at things like right now in the food industry, it's in a transformative time. Mm-hmm. We look at water shortages, we look at urbanization. Is it a really good and exciting time for you to be there right now, that you think, especially when we look at what food can do you think that that's an exciting time to be there?
Oh, definitely. So there's so much going on. And if you ask many people, what is going to be the biggest problem in the food industry or in the food science community in the next 20 years? It's going to be shortage of water, which doesn't sound like food science to anyone. But if you don't have water, you're not going to be able to process, you're not going to be able to do all sorts of things with the food. So it's a major piece. And it's an economical piece too. Water costs money. And so if you're going to look at, how do you process a food using less water, because you use less water, becomes less wastewater and all that. So yes, innovation, lots, that's the fun part. But expect to fail even more, because innovation is even that much further down the line.
Talk about what you've had to sacrifice, or do you think you've had to sacrifice? You're a mother of 2 children that are grown.
Yes.
You have a husband, so you've had to work a lot of long hours. But do you feel like that during this time that you've lost out on anything, or do you say it's only made things better because your daughter Jennifer's got a successful career, your son is doing the things he wants to do in his life, your husband, he kind of has his own thing that he likes to do, whether it's biking, whether you go on great trips together. I mean, so it seems like, everything is in its place where it should be, and you've had a really wonderful career. I mean, because I think a lot of women today feel like it's got to be one or the other. They have to have children or they have to have a career. They don't think they can have both. And now you're retired, but yet you're heading up you're going to be the president of an association. So you're proving the point that you don't have to give up something. What is your thoughts on that?
I still had to give up a little bit. So I gave up, I'm going to call it me time. So by the time I finished...
As a woman, you're saying there's no me time. Forget those massages, forget all that. Yeah.
Forget, it was a pleasure when my kids got a little older that I was able to go out to lunch with a friend. But that's okay, because everything else was so fulfilling, it was okay to put that part on hold. Did I read books? Only on vacation. Now I get to read books all the time.
So now you're going to have to tell us what books in a few minutes. Go ahead.
Well, junk books. But to me, it was all worth it. I can't imagine, it would drive me crazy if I just stayed at home with my kids. I love them dearly, but to me, I wouldn't have that gratification. So yes, I worked hard. I didn't have a lot of me time, but that's okay. It's fine.
So looking at that now, when you look back at things and you say you've had this career, you had, prior to what you did at NASA, you talked about what you did, now you're doing this, and you're looking at all the things. What are you going to do now? I mean, you've got IFT, you're got a garden. What are you going to do to fill the time that you're not at IFT? Because you're not at IFT enough. Well, what are you going to do? Read books? What do you plan? You're going to vacation more? What do you think you're going to do?
So we vacation more. So we plan to take 3.5 to 4 week international vacations a year. We're fortunate enough that we can do that.
Going to crash more weddings?
We'll crash weddings. Yeah, we crashed weddings in Vietnam and Nepal, and maybe we'll crash weddings in Thailand next year when we're there.
Fantastic.
So travel. Gardening, it's been taking a lot of my time because I enjoy it and I have the time to do it, so I can devote more time to it. Reading. I love to do crocheting and knitting, which I still need to do more of. I haven't picked it up enough. And, part of it is, all of a sudden, if I want to go to a festival on a weekend, I can do it.
So now you're finding your me time. So now is your me time.
Yeah.
Now is what you're doing. So gardening, is there any specific food scientist with a garden? I'm just trying to imagine what a food scientist grows in her garden. What are we growing?
Lots of fresh herbs and tomatoes and peppers and Japanese eggplants, though I don't know if I'm going to get any eggplants yet. Squashes, butternut and spaghetti squash and zucchini. Cucumbers, though so far I haven't seen any cucumbers. Corn, and that's probably it. But just enjoying and relearning this. I had a garden in graduate school, and I think when we were in Chicago in the 80s, but I haven't had a garden since, and I'm just enjoying it.
So what's the best advice for anyone who's watching and who says, I want to learn. I want to learn from Michele and say, you know what, I want to enjoy my life. I want to have a great career. I want to have a family. what is that advice you want to give someone and say, this is the time to have it all, but yet have to give up some things? What advice would you give them?
They have to be really organized with their time. That's one thing. I'm very fortunate that my husband helped out a lot, with the kids and everything. And then,
so Bob's happy right now that he's getting a little credit here.
Yeah, he better be. He deserves it. He deserves it. What also, it's giving up a little bit. So, I still wanted to make sure that everyone had a healthy meal for dinner. But was it a fancy meal? No, because I didn't have the time. But they still had a healthy meal. We did feel very strongly that we have family time. So even though both of them were in gymnastics and probably had practice until sometimes later in the evening or early evening, we still sat down as a family. We still did family vacations. But you had to be organized with your time and to realize you're going to have to sacrifice some things, whether it's a clean house or not being as thorough in figuring out how to do your vacation. Maybe you let things just happen sometimes instead of saying, I'm going to do this on this day and this on the next day. So, finding ways to sort of compromise without compromising what's important, looking at your priorities and making sure, for us it was memories, family memories.
So you were at NASA for how many years?
17 years.
17 years. You had this great career. What would you say you have 2 children. What would you say you are most proud of?
My children. I think they're great. That's our future. My kids are part of that future. But they're wonderful. And I'm so proud of what they've accomplished and who they are and what they've developed into. And, I'm sure some of it is what Bob and I did, and the other parts is just giving them that freedom to start exploring their passions and figuring out what they want to do.
So, wrapping up, Michele, what would you like if you had to give advice to anyone? What's the one word you would want to leave and say, here's the one word I want to leave with everyone to say, here's what I want them to think about?
Passion.
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 Here we go. Michele Perchonok, thank you for being
You're
there.
welcome.
We have a little bit of passion. Thank you very much.